So this is going to be very little data. I just want to tell some stories. So we'll see how that goes. But let me begin by acknowledging all the people who have worked on trying to preserve Oakwell, but in particular, the Lower Merion High School students. So these are some websites that you can go to. This one is particularly great. This is where the Lower Merion High School students have presented their own alternative plans for Oakwell. And I have to admit, I started working on this talk almost a year ago. And when I saw these students speaking at township meetings, I was moved by the passion and commitment of these students and their articulate speaking of their views on Oakwell. And so I agree, yes, the world needs these students. And yes, ask the kids, and not just ask the kids, but listen to what they have to say. And so I'm not going to be as eloquent as you guys were, but I'll do my best, and I stand with you. So let's go. So first, a land acknowledgement. I think this is particularly relevant to this talk because the land on which we live today was once free of white people. So it was the land of the Lenni Lenape. And so we like to give land acknowledgements in all our presentations. And I particularly want to focus on this statement in my acknowledgement of the continued presence of the Lenape people in their homeland. I affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief, Tamanen, that there be a harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of immigrants to this land, that would be us, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. And I think if Chief Tamanen were alive today, he might have added, and as long as there are trees in the forest. So let's talk about the history of Pennsylvania forests. I'm really going to start with William Penn's arrival in Pennsylvania. But the Lenni Lenape lived here for 10,000 years before William Penn arrived. And there's some misconceptions. Some people think that these native people were not good land managers. That appears to be not true. And so when William Penn came to Pennsylvania in 1682, there were about 3,000 Lenni Lenape living in this area of Eastern North America. So yes, they had intentional fires in the forest, but these were not the great conflagrations that we see today. These were ground level fires where the trees were not killed, used to clear the underbrush so they could farm crops. And so it's not true that the Lenni Lenape were poor land managers. In fact, there's evidence that they were quite good managers of the land on which they lived. So then came William Penn. And so King Charles in 1861 gave Pennsylvania to William Penn. That in itself is a long story, but I'm not going to talk about how William Penn got given this chunk of land called Pennsylvania by King Charles II. And so when he was given Pennsylvania, he recommended that care be taken to leave 1 acre of trees for every 5 acres cleared. And so he knew that colonization of Pennsylvania was going to involve clearing of some forest, and he wanted immediately to make sure that we don't clear everything. Let's make sure we're leaving about 20% intact. Well, that wish of William Penn never came into fruition. And so in 1682, William Penn arrived in North America, and at that time, forests covered 99% of the 29 million acres that comprise Pennsylvania. And he has described these, I'll show you in a minute, as seemingly endless and bountiful. They were cleared for construction and agriculture. You could use the wood for fuel and to make wooden implements. And he was aware that there were ecosystem services, although he didn't use those terms, like providing clean water, clothing, etc. So Pennsylvania's history of human-caused deforestation, which is what I'm going to talk about today, began around Philadelphia with the arrival of William Penn and other colonists in the late 1600s. And so we know what the forests were like when William Penn came here because he wrote about them. And so having been here for a year, he wrote back to the Committee of the Free Laborers in Society of Traders in London. This was a group of Quaker people who were formed to advise William Penn on the economic management of Pennsylvania. And so he wrote back to them. First of all, he had a little bit of a pet peeve that he needed to get off his chest. Apparently, people back in England had reported that William Penn had died, which was bad enough, but they also reported that he was a dead Jesuit. And so that kind of irked him. So that's how he started his letter. He was not a Jesuit, he was a Quaker. And so his letter is very well organized with Roman numeral headings. And he started off, and so this was really to get British people convinced that they should come to Pennsylvania and settle Pennsylvania. And so he talked about the soil, water, and air as not to be despised, which is not great praise, but I guess that's a positive thing to say. But this is really interesting. The air is sweet and clear, the heavens serene, like the south parts of France, rarely overcast. And so if you've been to Britain, it's commonly overcast. And so I think everybody in Britain wishes they were in the south parts of France. And so William Penn says, you don't have to go there. You can come to Pennsylvania. He talks about the waters and the seasons of the year. And if you want to read this letter, there's a link to the entire letter at the bottom of this page. I will just talk about a couple of other aspects of this letter. He talked about the natural produce of the country, the vegetables, and particularly its trees in this section, all of which there is plenty for the use of man. And so this was his way of telling people back in Britain, if you come here, there's plenty of wood. There's plenty of wood that you can use to build with and you can make a living from. And so that was a way of selling Pennsylvania. He talked about the fruits that were abundant in the woods. And so not only is there wood, but there's naturally growing fruits all over the place in these forests. So it's a place of bounty. And I particularly like this one of living creatures. And I'm not going to read all of this to you, but there's a couple of interesting things, some for food and some for profit. So again, Penn wanted people to come to Pennsylvania where food is plentiful and you can make a living. And so that was kind of his overall message. At the time, there were elk in Pennsylvania. Today, there are no elk. There are some eat young bear and commended. So there were no bears in Britain in the 1600s. And so I want to talk about bears. There are 40 and 50 pound turkeys. We don't have 40 and 50 pound turkeys today. So I don't know if he was just making that up or if turkeys were really gigantic when William Penn came. These things called heath birds, I'll talk a little bit about them. Eating waterfowl was common in all of Europe in the 1600s, continues today, but the duck and teal are better than he's ever had in any other countries. So, and there were other animals like fishers, panthers, and wolves. He was hopeful that there would be cod in the bay. Well, that actually never happened. There probably are a few cod, but it never were enough to be commercially fished. So if we look at this letter, here are 5 animals that he mentioned that are no longer in Pennsylvania. They have been extirpated or are extinct, largely because of changing of habitat, largely from deforestation. So there's been implications for animals as well as trees. Here are some examples. This is a heath hen. You haven't seen one because they went extinct entirely in 1933. The last heath hen was an individual called Booming Ben on Martha's Vineyard, who was last seen in 1932. So this animal is completely extinct now. It used to be very abundant. And I mentioned that there were elk. Elk were exterminated from eastern Pennsylvania and from the entire state pretty early on. And of course, wolves and mountain lions and fisher cats have also been extirpated from Pennsylvania. There's actually been a reintroduction of fisher cats, and there's some populations in the northwestern part of Pennsylvania that are doing pretty well. And so the forests that Penn described in Pennsylvania are nothing like the forests that we have today for lots of reasons. And a lot of this is because of deforestation. And so deforestation initially went on at a pretty slow clip. So as more people arrived in Pennsylvania, there was a need to clear more land, there was a need to build more things. And so there was clearing of the forest, but at a moderately slow pace. But then there was this physician, Benjamin Rush, who was a Philadelphia physician, who wrote an account in 1899 suggesting that when the British were occupying Philadelphia, they cleared large areas of land outside the city. So there was a massive peak in deforestation during the Revolutionary War. And Rush argued that this deforestation actually caused health problems for people living in Philadelphia. And so this is kind of forward looking because it turns out there's literature today that verifies this, that deforestation does negatively affect human health. And I'll mention one example later on. And so only 11 years later, beginning in the 1800s, deforestation began on a massive scale through commercial logging. And so there were enough people here, there was a big enough demand for lumber that people started creating businesses of clear cutting forest and making lumber and tools as well. And so before 1850, this was all done by hand. So all the trees were cut by people with saws, and the cutting of the trees into planks was all done by using these gigantic hand saws. So it wasn't very efficient. And so deforestation sort of began picking up pace in the early 1800s, but it really picked up when circular sawmills were invented. These were huge bladed circular sawmills that the blades were as much as a half-inch thick. And so there's a lot of loss of wood during the processing of big trees in circular sawmills, but it really increased the rate of deforestation in Pennsylvania. This is an example of a restored circular sawmill at the Spacht sawmill, which is still in operation here in southeastern Pennsylvania. And then I just have to say this. Forestry and deforestation picked up again when, instead of circular saws, it was the invention of the modern bandsaw mill. And so this is like a bandsaw you would see in a person's shop today, but much more massive in scale. And so by the time these bandsaws for timber companies were invented, almost all the wood had been harvested from Pennsylvania. So this really affected deforestation in the northwestern United States. If you want to read this tantalizing piece, The Evolution of Modern Bandsaw Mills for Sawing Logs, here's the link to it, and you can read that on your own. Okay, so cutting down a forest in those days was nothing like what it is today. So there was no sustainable management at all. And so this is an article that was published in 1977, which is a pretty good article that goes into more detail about what I'm talking about today. But the way that logging was done was you cut the best and ruin the rest. Or for every one mature tree, an average of 50 saplings were killed. And so there was no regeneration. And so here's a picture of Big Pocono. Some of you may have been to Big Pocono in Pennsylvania in 1922. All the trees have been eliminated. And as a result of that, all the branches were left behind. So only the big logs were taken. So there was lots of dead brush. And so there were lots of fires. And so this is an example of a landscape that has been burned, which is the part that had not burned up here. And so fires basically got rid of all the brush, and all you had was bare soil. And it rains a lot in Pennsylvania. And so as a result of clear cutting and fires and rain, there were huge eroded hillsides across Pennsylvania. So this was a very unsustainable way of doing logging or carrying out deforestation. So there's some milestones in Pennsylvania logging history I just want to talk about. So the first log boom was built on the Susquehanna River. So many of you probably don't know what a log boom is. And so this is a remnant of a log boom on the Susquehanna River. And so this is crib. So this is one of the cribs that remnants are still in existence on the Susquehanna. So it's an island of stone and timber, 22 feet high. And there are lots of these, 352 of these, stretching over 7 miles in a slow moving stretch of the Susquehanna River. And so logs were cut and transported to the Susquehanna River and floated downstream, where they would get caught by the boom. And men and boys would be standing on these big piles of logs and sorting them. So each log that was cut had a stamp on it to identify the company to which that wood belonged. And through the use of these booms, this big mass of wood could be separated into sections. So one section would go here for one company, another section would go here for another company. And so these separated portions of the log boom would lead to sawmills that belonged to that company. And so there was a sorting of wood, and there were as many as 60 sawmills adjacent to the Susquehanna River when logging was at its peak. So the log boom made things a lot more efficient. You could transport logs by water, So you didn't have to use horses, and you could sort them and send them to the appropriate company that cut down that wood. And so as a result of this, there was a huge boom in logging or deforestation in Pennsylvania, such that Williamsport, Pennsylvania, the home of Lycoming College, was the lumber capital of the world for this 40 years. So it produced more lumber than any other place on earth. Williamsport had more millionaires than any other city in the United States. And over this 30-year period, 5.5 billion board feet of timber was produced as a result of deforestation of massive amounts of forest in central Pennsylvania. So the log boom really increased deforestation rates in Pennsylvania. 1871 was the first logging railroad in Pennsylvania. And so prior to logging railroads, when you cut a tree down on a slope, you would have to drag it down to a river to float it downstream to where it would be processed. And this was a long and tedious process, fairly inefficient. And so these logging railroads were built on temporary tracks. So a company would build a track, put the train on it, and the train would carry these logs down to a river typically, and then they would be floated downriver. And so these were pretty unstable things because the track and the bed was not meant to be permanent. And so this train, this is an engine, is supposed to be on the track. And so this was a pretty precarious situation with these first logging railroads. And in addition, of course, these were fueled by wood. So there was a wood burner that created steam that provided the propulsion of the trains. And so sparks would fly out from these stoves that were fueling the train every now and then. And these would actually create forest fires. And so although this made for logging to be more efficient, it also was not only dangerous for the people operating on the railroads, but it caused a lot of forest fires. Okay, so this is something that came out from the Pennsylvania Department of Forest and Waters in 1928 to 1929, forest trees to plant in Pennsylvania. And in this document, which it appears that I don't have the link for that, I'm sorry. Between 1860 and 1870, Pennsylvania was the greatest lumber producing region on the face of the earth. Only a few decades have passed, so now we're in 1928 and 1929, since those great lumbering days. Yet today, fewer than 25,000 acres of original forest remain in Pennsylvania. So we went from 29 million acres of forest to 25,000, or 91% of the original forests that William Penn saw have been converted to those barren landscapes that were not productive and did not reforest very well on their own. So that's a pretty phenomenal number that almost all of Pennsylvania was 100% deforested. And so then comes this fellow named Joseph T. Rothrock. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Joseph T. Rothrock because he's an important figure in the reforestation of Pennsylvania. And so I'm going to call this section A New Era. So Rothrock was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was also a Pennsylvania Dutchman. I have Pennsylvania Dutch heritage, and Pennsylvania Dutch people are financially efficient, let's just put it that way. And this appalled him that there was all these trees that had the potential to provide income for people if they had been sustainably managed were gone. And he was just appalled by this. And so he started to campaign for reforestation in Pennsylvania. And this all started in Philadelphia, where a few Philadelphia women, I don't know who these women were, became interested enough to hold a public meeting on forest conservation in the hall of the Historical Society, a building which still exists in Philadelphia today, on 26th of May, 1886. A few days later, that resulted in the formation of the Pennsylvania Forestry Association with Rothrock as president. So this was not a government organization. This was a private organization that wanted to promote reforestation in Pennsylvania. 8 days later, the Pennsylvania Forestry Association adopts its constitution. So you're going to have a new organization, you got to have a constitution. This is the simplest constitution I've ever seen. So you got to give the organization an official name. So Article 1 is, we are the Pennsylvania Forestry Association. Article 2, although short, is pretty forward-looking. And so the object or objective of the association shall be to secure and maintain a due proportion of forest throughout the state. So reforestation, to provide information, so be educational as well about the growth and protection of forest, to show the great evils. So that's a pretty strong statement resulting from forest destruction, and for things like available water supplies. So we now know that removal of trees from properties results in greater flow of water into rivers and streams. And so this was a pretty forward-looking thing because hydrology was really not the science back then. Impoverishment of the soil and changing climate. So all of these things were not common words back in the late 1800s. And to get the legislature of Pennsylvania to do something about it. So this was a lobbying organization. And so they worked for about 5 years. And then Rothrock decided he had to do more. And so he quit his job at the University of Pennsylvania and took his forest conservation and reforestation show on the road. And so he traveled the great state of Pennsylvania, giving talks wherever anybody would listen to him, to try to convince them that forest conservation and reforestation is something that Pennsylvania needed to do. A couple of years later, after he quit Penn, he was appointed as the botanist to the two-man state forestry commission charged with studying the forest conditions in Pennsylvania, which were pretty poor, and determining what lands might be acquired or purchased by the state as reserves and targeted for reforestation. And so a couple of years later, Pennsylvania established the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, and within it, the Pennsylvania Division of Forestry. A couple of years later, Rothrock gave this talk about fire and flood, the scourge of Pennsylvania, probably inspired by what we now know as the Oil City flood of 1892. And so Oil City is a town in Pennsylvania where there was oil that was being pumped by oil platforms. And on June 5th, there was a huge rainstorm, and because there were no trees on the slopes leading into the river in Oil City, there was massive, massive flooding. And there are some pictures of this that you can see on the web. And Rothrock knew that a major contributor of this flood, disastrous flood in Oil City, was the lack of trees on the slopes, so there's more runoff when it rains, creating that flood. He also estimated at that time that the annual area of burned land was equivalent to a strip 1 mile wide and 28 miles long. So this is the kind of speaking that Rothrock could do. Nobody really knows when we talk about how many square miles of something, it's hard to envision. But if you envision a strip 1 mile wide and 208 miles long, that's a big chunk of land. That's bigger than Delaware County today. But then a few years later, the Division of Forestry, which had been created up here as part of agriculture, became its own department, the Department of Forestry. Pennsylvania was the first state to have a Department of Forestry, and they appointed Joseph Rothrock as its commissioner. And so at that time, almost all the Pennsylvania lands were largely deforested because of these terrible harvesting practices. And Rothrock termed the phrase the Pennsylvania desert because of this desolation over most of the state. So at the time, the state had purchased 110,000 acres of land to be state reservation land. And during his tenure as the commissioner of the Department of Forestry, this would grow to over 500,000 acres over the next 2 years. So he actively went out and bought land to try to reforest it. Towards the end of his career, he wrote this article, published this article in this journal. If the Commonwealth would plant and protect 20 million trees annually, that's a lot of trees. It would merely be trifling with a situation that required an effort 50 times as great to reforest those areas in immediate need of forest cover. So this was his warning that the scope of this is gigantic and we just need to do a lot more. And so he also realized that just preaching about this wasn't really getting much progress. And so he changed his tune a little bit to pitch that if we could rehabilitate forests with proper management and reforestation, we could then regrow timber, sustain it, harvest it sustainably, and people could make money again. And so once he put this in the context of money, then reforestation kind of took off. I just mentioned, so impressive was the work of Rothrock, that 2 years after Rothrock died, 1922. So in 1924, the town of McVeytown, Pennsylvania, Rothrock's birthplace, erected a monument with a plaque, and Gifford Pinchot came to McVeytown and gave a speech, and this was part of his speech, which clearly shows his reverence and appreciation for the work of Rothrock, who faced public indifference in the face of ridicule and often open opposition and secret detraction. But Rothrock persevered. So Gifford Pinchot really appreciated that. And if you're thinking, what is that? Who is that guy, Gifford Pinchot? It kind of rings a bell. Well, you probably know him as his work with the U.S. Forest Service. He was the first head of the Forest Service, but he also was the governor of Pennsylvania for 2 terms, not contiguous. And so that's Gifford Pinchot. And so today, Pennsylvania honors these leaders in reforestation, forest sustainable harvesting by the Gifford Pinchot State Park and the Rothrock State Forest, which of course you can go visit today. Okay, so there have been other challenges to Pennsylvania forests besides this widespread logging, and I just want to talk about several of those. So for American chestnuts, and so these giant chestnuts are not second growth. So these are the giant trees that would have been in Pennsylvania before the widespread logging. Okay, so all these trees were cut down in Pennsylvania through the logging disasters that I just talked about. And so this is what a chestnut fruit looks like. And people would go out and harvest chestnuts, kind of a family affair. Nat King Cole's song, Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire, was written and inspired by this kind of activity. So chestnuts were kind of a family activity to do before they were all cut down. So they started to come back after Rothrock and reforestation started to happen. And so in the 1900s, there were sites that had been logged 100 years ago, believe it or not. And so those trees were developing second growth forests. They were kind of on the scrawny side, but there were lots of second growth forests. There were 4 billion chestnut trees throughout Appalachia. It's a lot of trees. Half of the trees in the forest were American chestnuts. And they're tall, they're large, they're fast growing. They can grow in sun, they can grow in shade. So this is just kind of a wonder tree. It's great for making stuff because the wood is pretty rot resistant. And so sometimes today, if you're walking in the woods and you see a dead tree that's almost 100% decomposed and it looks a little orangey, that could be a dead chestnut tree because it doesn't decompose very well. It's used for furniture, fencing, all kinds of uses for this wood because it's so straight grained. So it's a good wood to work with if you're a carpenter. It's also important for animals. So all those chestnuts produced by 5 billion trees, that's a lot of food. And so chestnuts were eaten not just by humans, but insects, birds, and mammals. They were actually harvested as a major feed for hogs and cattle. And again, nut ripening and gathering during the holiday season, Nat King Cole, chestnuts roasting on an open fire. Until this guy, Cryphonecta parasitica, a parasitic fungus, arrives in North America. So this is the fungus that causes chestnut blight, which ultimately kills trees. So it's not native to America. And so we didn't have chestnut blight until the early 1900s. It probably arrived in imported nursery stock that came from East Asia and Southeast Asia. And so this is what happens when a tree is infected with Cryphonecta parasitica. The fungus invades the tissues where there's xylem and phloem, preventing the transport of water and nutrients up and down the tree, and then the tree dies. Okay, so the first discovery of Cryphonecta parasitica was in chestnut trees in the Bronx Zoo in 1904. And so that's when we first knew that trees were dying. So we don't know exactly when this fungus arrived in the United States. It may have been a little bit prior to 1904. And that parasite, that fungus, marched downward through the Appalachians. So this is the natural range of American chestnut, and killed every single tree. So 4 billion trees were killed over 40 years as the fungus moved farther and farther south. So within about 50 years, 4 billion of chestnut trees throughout Appalachia were killed. So this is what scenes look like. And so 50% of the trees in these forests had been second growth forests, so they're not big giant trees, had been American chestnuts, and all of them died. So this is what forests looked like in Pennsylvania in the 1920s or so, 1930s. There are still some American chestnuts that have not been infected, some populations in Wisconsin and Michigan, but every one of them in Appalachia died. Now, sometimes you can be walking in the woods and you can see one, a really small one, small diameter trunk. That's a root sprout. So the roots of these trees, when they died, would sprout new above ground trees, but those trees would be infected and they wouldn't last very long. So that's the demise of American chestnut. Here's another example. This is elms, American elms. It's a dominant forest tree, especially in the Northeast. It's not as dominant in Pennsylvania, but it was a major tree in Pennsylvania. It's also the most commonly planted street and shade tree in cities and towns of the United States, because when you plant it alone without neighbors around it's massive. It has this great spreading form, provides lots and lots of shade. And so town commons or town greens would often have American elms planted on them because people could go there on a hot summer day and relax in the shade. Elm Street is the 16th most common street name in the United States. There are 4,671 elm streets in the United States. So it was an important tree. Until a fungus arrives in North America. And so the fungus is Ophiostoma nova ulmi, causing what we now refer to as Dutch elm disease. And so it's thought that this fungus arrived in a shipment of elm logs from Europe. So it's a little curious that we were importing elm logs from Europe, but we did. And they got put on a train and were sent to a lumber mill in Ohio to be processed into veneers. So veneer is really thin sheets of wood that you like put on tabletop, make tabletops out of. And so this wood was infected with this fungus, and when it got to Ohio, that's where it started to spread. And it's just like the Dutch elm disease. The fungus spreads, it grows in the bark. So an infected tree can be infected by bark beetles. I'll show you a picture of them in a minute. And so bark beetles burrow through the underneath the bark and pick up fungal spores. Then they go to another tree, and that tree becomes infected by the fungus. And so it spreads by this vector, the bark beetle. And it's pretty much lethal. So within 50 years after its arrival, 50 to 100 million elm trees had been killed. And that was as of 1977 in the Northeast, where 75% of the elms had died. So this was an extremely important forest tree, many of which died. So you can still find some elms in forests today, but they're not as common as they once were. And so this is what the bark beetle does. So between the bark and the wood, where the xylem and the phloem are, the water and food conducting tissues, the bark beetle burrows all over the place and cuts those connections. And so that's what kills the tree. And when it does that, it picks up spores of the fungus. And so when the bark beetle decides to leave this tree and go to another tree, it infects the other tree. And so this is what it looked like in Winnipeg, Canada, when elm trees were healthy. And this is that same street that killed every single elm tree through Dutch elm disease. And that's the beetle. It's a tiny, tiny little bark beetle that spreads the fungus. Okay, ash trees. So this is a little bit more common. So these are all pictures of ash trees in Pennsylvania. And they're also a common tree in cities because they too, when they're grown by themselves, have this great spreading form and provide lots of shade. But they're also an important forest tree. And so there's this thing that you probably heard of, the emerald ash borer, that is now affecting ash trees in Pennsylvania. It affects several species of ash. So these are two of the more common species in Pennsylvania, the green ash here and the white ash. So these trees are very widespread throughout eastern North America. This is the little critter. We've heard a lot about this in the news in Pennsylvania over the past couple of years. So prior to its arrival, there were 300 million ash trees in Pennsylvania. It's a lot of ash trees. 800 billion ash trees in North America. So the emerald ash borer burrows into the bark of the tree and lays eggs, and those eggs hatch, and the larvae, these little white guys, tunnel through the tree underneath the bark, between the bark and the wood, cut off the xylem and the phloem, and kill the tree. And so this is not a native species, and it's only introduced in the United States relatively recently, first detected in 2002 and first detected in Pennsylvania in 2007. Now it's widespread throughout Pennsylvania. A tree that gets visited by an emerald ash borer that lays her eggs, 99% of infected trees die, usually fairly quickly, within 2 to 4 years. So your tax dollars at work, the USDA set up a monitoring program when emerald ash borer was first detected. And this is actually an information figure, so I don't have too many of these. The yellow counties, so each one of these is a county, show emerald ash borer detections over this 10-year period. So it probably arrived somewhere 2002 or a little bit before, and it was widespread in New York and totally ubiquitous in Michigan. Not that wasn't in this part of Pennsylvania, but we then look at this is 2002 to 2020. It's everywhere. So yellow means that they have been detected, and the red would be new detections in 2021. There were no new detections. It was everywhere. So this is what it might have looked like. So this is actually, I think, from Canada, Ontario, Canada. So this is a forest that was dominated by an ash species. And you can see, like the chestnut, all these ashes are dead. Or here's one from Wisconsin. And so the abundance of ash depends on the type of forest. So some types of forests have abundant ash and some are less. And so you can tell that this little curved part had a lot of ashes and they're all dead. And these green parts probably don't have any ashes in them. So that's why they don't look that way. Or this happens to be my own property that I own in this part of Pennsylvania. And all of these, it's about 7 acres, and all of these are dead ash trees. So I had a fair amount of ash in my woods and they're all dead, including this giant. And so there was a giant ash tree next to the road. PICO was concerned that it was going to fall over and knock over the power lines. And so essentially the tree was condemned. And so they cut it down. Took them 2 days. I watched the whole thing, quite the process. Kind of sad for me, but I did watch it. This is the bottom stump of the trunk that's getting loaded onto one of those PICO trucks. It almost filled up the whole bed of the truck. And so this tree, by counting the rings, started growing in 1830, which is the year that my house was built. And so I will tell you that my woods are protected by a conservation easement, and my house is protected by a preservation easement, so neither can be developed or changed. Okay, so ash trees are valuable. Not only are they abundant in forests, but 50% of street trees, especially with the demise of elms, are ash trees. And there's this urban heat island effect. So we now know, we have good data to support this, trees in cities in particular cause cooling. And there's lots of reasons for that, and we can talk about why that is. And so this alone is a pretty major importance of ash trees. When the ash trees die, cities are going to get hotter. They're used to make all kinds of things. I'm not going to mention these except baseball bats. And so if you own an old baseball bat that's wooden, it was probably made from ash, you might want to hang onto it because it might become valuable. We're not going to be making baseball bats out of ash anymore. They make a boatload of seeds. And so this is what the seeds look like when they've fallen off the tree. And these are an important source of food for birds, mice, squirrels, small mammals. One tree can produce between 2,500 and 12,000 seeds in 1 year. And so that's a lot of seeds. And so just like the chestnut, when we lost all the chestnut nuts, food for animals decreased dramatically. This is the same thing. And so the demise of ash has implications for food supply for the animals that have relied on this huge amounts of seeds that are produced. And ash trees are also great for birds such as woodpeckers, like this pileated. It's blurry because I took the picture and I'm not a good photographer. Okay, so I mentioned that there's a cooling effect of ash trees. And so this is an assessment published in Ecological Economics. I'm not going to go through the details of the paper, but basically it looked at emerald ash borer killing of trees in cities and concluded that it will cause an increase in temperature, and that increase in temperature, although small, will result in 100,000 annual deaths and 10 to 100,000 additional emergency department visits, or cumulative health costs of all that, of a 10% loss of tree canopy. So if the city has 10% of its trees as ashes, 10% loss will have a real cost, an economic cost of 18 million over 25 years. And so loss of forest, loss of trees is not just an ecological thing, it's an economic thing as well. Okay, a couple of things. So what about today? So we think, well, there's lots of forest in Pennsylvania, and that's true. In 2021 data, 16 million acres of forest land, or 58% of the state. So that's great compared to the Pennsylvania desert of James Rothrock, where we only had 9% of forested land. Now we're back up to 58%. And so reforestation was going on, and we were increasing forested area land in Pennsylvania for a long time, but it peaked in 2013. And we're at 17 million acres, this number. And it's declined since by about 378 acres. So why is it peaked and now declining? Some of this is conversion of forest land to agriculture. A lot of it is development, including things like taking Oakwell and replacing the trees with athletic fields and parking lots and roads. So that would be something that would contribute to forest loss in Pennsylvania. And so who owns these lands, these 17 million acres? It's mostly private, which is kind of surprising. So Rothrock did increase the path of the state owning land in state forests and state parks, but most of the land is in private ownership. And so because it's in private ownership, then we can have lots of this stuff going on with very little impediment. So you might think, well, that deforestation is not happening locally. This is not a local thing. It's other people out west that are cutting down forests for development and agriculture. Well, it is happening locally. So there's a great website, Global Forest Watch. So this is actually a link. You can go here and you can click on any county in the United States. And I think maybe places around the world. And there are data on deforestation. And so this is loss of forested area in square miles per year in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, from 2001 to 2021. And so it goes up and it goes down, been going up lately. The 20-year loss is 2.75 square miles of forest in Montgomery County alone. So that's a big chunk of forest that's just lost. We can take these numbers and convert them to carbon dioxide emissions. So these trees are no longer taking CO2 out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis and making tree and making root. And the soils underneath those trees are going to start losing organic matter when the trees are gone. And so if we convert this to CO2 emissions associated with this, so the shape of the curve looks the same, but the units are different. And so if you add up the 20-year carbon dioxide emissions that result from deforestation, it's 248,000 tons of CO2, or emissions from 2,760 cars per year in Montgomery County alone. And so you might think, well, how does that relate to Oakwell? So Oakwell, Dr. Adam Langley, a colleague of ours in our Center for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Stewardship, had his students, he went out with his students and calculated CO2 emission equivalents of resulting of loss of the trees. So trees are not carrying out photosynthesis and they're being processed into something, and carbon loss from the soil. over 15 years, and that loss is 4.64 kilotons. So even though the property is tiny, 13 and a half acres compared to Montgomery County, this is a rather large loss of carbon from a pretty small chunk of land because the trees are so abundant and so big, so massive. Okay, we'll talk about Oakwell a little bit and then I'll wrap this up. So I want to make the point that as much as I'm an ecologist and I would like to see the beautiful trees on Oakwell preserved, there's also architectural and landscape architectural significance to the property that I think makes it unique. So it's not just the woods, it's other things as well. So I'm not a historian, I'm not a landscape architect, I'm not an architect, but I think I appreciate these kinds of things. And so many architects and landscape architects were involved in the property now known as Oakwell. And so probably the most famous are the Olmsted brothers. So this is a firm that was started by Frederick Law Olmsted. His children eventually took it over. They're known for lots of things. And so they believe that you can use landscape architecture, sculpting of lands with trees for the betterment of people, that having healthy forests and parks is a good thing for the well-being of people. They believe that. So much so that when they were asked to design the 1915 San Diego Exposition grounds, they said, no, the place is too beautiful to do it. They're not going to do it. So that's kind of the mentality that the Olmsted brothers had. They had lots of different projects, including numerous private estates and homesteads, including Oakwell and its neighbor Stoneleigh. And so this is the 1914 Olmsted Plan. So you can read the fine print on there. It's called for Stoneleigh. So at the time, Oakwell was part of Stoneleigh. That's a whole other history that I don't need to get into. And I particularly want to talk about these two things, the tea house and the greenhouses, which are on the property now known as Oakwell. There are two other properties that are also historically significant, but are not part of Oakwell proper. So let's just talk about the tea house and the greenhouse and why they are historically significant. Frank Jones Day, famous architect, worked out of Philadelphia. And Frank Jones Day is the person who designed the greenhouse that's on Oakwell. And so you can read about Frank Jones Day here, or there's a website down here to read about a little more. And so why the greenhouse is so significant, other than it was designed by Frank Jones Day, is that it was different. So this was an innovation in landscape architecture. And in particular, this is an article from the 1903 issue of House and Garden magazine. If you want to read the whole article, it's kind of fun to read. That's the link, so you can read the whole article. This is just the first page. And written by Frank Jones Day and brothers, so the company that designed the greenhouse at Oakwell. And basically he says, there's lots of properties with greenhouses on them. They're ugly. They're all ugly. And there's piles of compost outside and wheelbarrows and tools and leaves. And they're just an eyesore. And so Frank Miles Day, not Jones Day, wanted to do something different. So he built the greenhouses on what we now know as Oakwell, as being enclosed within this brick structure. It's actually quite beautiful. And so this was really a renovation and the first of its kind in landscape architecture, and why it's so historically significant. And so my personal view is I don't want to see this go. Okay, there's a tea house. And so apparently tea houses were popular at one time in the United States. In the early 1900s, I was not around, but tea houses were a common thing to have. And so the tea house on the property now known as Oakwell was designed by George Pentecost and his partner Ferruccio Vitali. So both of these were fairly famous landscape architects, and some of the projects that they're known for are listed here. Pentecost was a founder of the American Society for Landscape Architecture. It's kind of an interesting quote from this article from 1900. Until the art of landscape architecture is clearly distinguished from that of gardening, as well as architecture, forestry, and other closely allied callings, no such future can be reasonably expected. And so he really believed that landscape architecture was a new thing, it was a thing of its own, and they had to make that clear. So two other famous landscape architects. And there's the mansion itself. So the mansion itself is protected. It won't be developed under any plans from the township. But it was designed by the Wilson brothers, major company in Philadelphia. These are some examples of things that they've designed. So I'm sure you'll recognize a lot of those. So that's another major architect, you know, that was related to the property on Oakwell. And so here's some websites. And so you can learn more about Oakwell, about the forest, about the history by going to all of these, as well as the Lower Merion Conservancy, whom I have to thank for teaching me a lot about Oakwell. If you have any questions, you can email me. That's my email address. We are going to post this talk online. It may take a while to do that. So when we do that, we'll send out emails to let people know what the link is, but you can always click on this and this will take you to our center website, and we'll post the link to the recording of this on that website probably in a few days. And so I've got a couple more slides. Summary. I guess broader summary is, I think the property is valuable and worthy of conservation because of this combination of ecological importance and social importance with its links to landscape architects and architecture. Since we impend the forest of Pennsylvania have repeatedly been disturbed by human activity. Sometimes it's fungi, but those fungi got here because of people. And they have been remarkably resilient. Starting from the deserts of Pennsylvania that happened with the height of logging, forests came back. And so when you go outside and you're walking in the woods today, you're probably walking in secondary forests that are now being accosted by emerald ash borer, and its composition is going to change again. But forests have remained forests in Pennsylvania. They're just very different from William Penn's. They've been resilient, so they now cover about 50% of Pennsylvania's land area, about half in private ownership, but forest cover peaked in 2013. So now we're moving backwards because of conversion of forest to agriculture and development. So that's kind of an unfortunate trend and probably going in the wrong direction. Montgomery County is losing that much, and it's equivalent to a lot of CO2 emissions. In case you don't know, Villanova has said that they would buy Oakwell. They were in the process of negotiating the purchase of Oakwell when the land was condemned and taken by eminent domain by the township. So Villanova still says it's willing to buy Oakwell. I don't know what they would do with it. So I have not seen any plans for what Villanova would do with Oakwell. And so this talk is not directed just to Lower Merion Township government officials or people who want to conserve Oakwell. It's also directed toward people at Villanova, such that if Villanova did purchase Oakwell, my message to them is the same. Let's try and save it. Because it's not a huge property, but it's got ecological value. It's an old remnant forest, second growth forest. It's got a lot of beautiful, huge trees. It's got some trees that were probably planted by Olmsted in the original landscaping of that property. And so that's pretty important. These trees are important in terms of carbon cycling, water cycling, and habitat. And so they're a huge ecological value to the Oakwell property. It has historical value. So there are 5 fairly renowned architects and landscape architects who have been involved in the land and the buildings that are on Oakwell. And it's kind of rare to have this combination of a property with this much ecological value and this much historical value. And it's that combination that I think confers a special status to Oakwell. And so there are social values. And so if we conserve, we meaning all of us, conserve Oakwell, it would honor the history, it would honor ecology, it would be consistent with a conservation ethic. And if it were made open to the public, it would be a place of peace and the kind of thing that the Olmsted brothers envisioned back when they designed the landscape of Oakwell. So there's that. Or athletic fields and parking lots. That's the choice. And so I'm going to leave you with one more slide. And it's kind of something that I'm going to pose for you to think, for all of us to think about. And here's the slide.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wieder, for this.
You're welcome. My
Really,
pleasure.
yeah, we really appreciate it, Kel. So with that, I'm happy to moderate any questions in the chat. If you came on a little bit later, we had said that the reason we don't have like open questioning on this webinar is that Villanova's policies suggest that if we post it and record it, we need to kind of keep it in this framework where so we're not violating anyone's privacy. So if you have any questions for Dr. Wieder, and there's also already a couple great things in the chat, please feel free to type them into the chat and I'll be happy to pose them to him. One note by Peggy Hartzell, thanks Peggy, this is awesome information, is that there is, oh, I just lost, yeah, sorry. There's a Rothrock celebration in Westchester at Marshall Square this Sunday, actually, which is amazing, between 1 and 4. So that's really exciting. It's very cool.
Wow.
I know, how cool. It's
Yeah, I didn't know.
and Peggy put the address of that park in the chat, which is awesome. Another note to me to just note is that if anyone else is wants to learn more about some of the history of these structures and details about the architecture at Oakwell, there is more information on this at growoakwell.com. And also, for those of you that don't know, we did a BioBlitz at Oakwell last weekend, and there's more details about the species that can be found on the property now through the history link and the BioBlitz link on the Grow Oakwell website. So thank you for that information in the chat. So the first question, Dr. Wieder, that we have is, what are some ways that Villanova is doing to help preserve Oakwell? What are some ways Villanova students can be involved in this movement to preserve and conserve Oakwell? Great question.
So there's lots of things that are going on, but they're probably not at the same scale as Upper Marion Township High School. Dr. Langley, Dr. Adam Langley, has been involved talking about the ecosystem services benefits of Oakwell. So he's given presentations on that. We've had students that have participated in the protests that Lower Marion High School students have on a regular basis. So some of our students have joined them, made their own signs. What else, Dr. Chapman?
Yeah, we've been lucky enough to have Aaron Batley give a talk to Villanova community about the history of Oakwell, which is really great through a history seminar series we have. But yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, Dr. Langley class's assessment of the carbon value of Oakwell was one of the first things we did. And then our center, you know, since we were formed kind of during this time, wrote a letter. Various members of our center have written letters and, you know, to these meetings. You know, I think I see our role as a center as being hopefully, you know, both a source of potential scientific information, but as Dr. Wieder nicely showed, you know, I think this has gone way beyond science at this point, and we know that there's kind of a moral and ethical issue that's to this. So, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, and I think that so many of the people on this call who have worked so hard giving tours of Oakwell and educating the public and protesting for so many really years now, have done so much work, you know, way more compared than we have done at Villanova. And this, as Dr. Wieder said, and there was a question in the chat by Sean about the purchase of Villanova by Villanova. You know, that purchase desire was reiterated just last week, and it was again said that Villanova would buy the whole property. In terms of what would be done with it, I think it is very clear, and we at CBEST are making it very clear that, you know, there would be able to be no destruction of the historical and ecological resources at Oakwell because it's so precious. And I think that Villanova knows that as a neighbor. But I also think it's really important. Oakwell has become so beloved to so many people in the larger community that it would be really important that it would be available for everyone to use and sort of experience, as Dr. Wieder said, as like a place of peace. And so I think I would be very much committed to that if Villanova was to do that. But as the latest we heard, the school district was not interested in that purchase offer. But I don't know how recently, I'm not in real estate by any means. So when that was most recently offered.
Let me just add quickly that our students use Stoneleigh a lot. So a lot. So Dr. Chapman and I are teaching a freshman general biology course, and this Saturday, hopefully it'll be good weather, 200 students are going to go over to Stoneleigh and do a scavenger hunt. So they have to find plant species, and the students really love it. So I think if Oakwell were to become accessible to us, we would have a lot of activity over there from our students.
Agreed. Other questions? Oh, cool. As an art photography teacher at Henderson High School near Marshall Square, that park's actually been used as a classroom. And so, yeah, I think that kind of goes along with what Dr. Wieder just said in terms of using this area as an outdoor classroom. Like that's something we've been talking about a lot in our center, is having more access for our students at Villanova to sort of outdoor learning and outdoor classrooms. And we use some of the natural spaces on campus. And something we've talked to Ethan over at Stoneleigh about, and it would be amazing to do this with Oakwell as well, is to have sort of a green corridor, right? From Villanova, with the assurance that we would have to conserve some of the new properties that Villanova's purchased along County Line, and then kind of extend that over into Oakwell and Stoneleigh. It would be really amazing to increase the amount of natives there and, create this green corridor and habitat for both humans and other organisms. A couple other comments and questions. So did both the chestnut trees and the ash tree get their infections from humans, or did it occur due to the environment, Dr. Wieder?
Well, so the cause of death is the fungi. But the fungi that are not native to North America arrived here because of human activity, importing things from other places in the world. This is a common thing with how invasive species get here. It's not intentional, it's by accident. And so, although we are not the direct cause of the death of a tree, we are the agents that brought the fungi here. Not intending to, of course, but.
Yeah, a lot of times through shipping and importing, particularly with wood pallets. We had a great seminar about this a couple of years ago by a scientist named Gary Levitt on how wood pallets, as they're brought in, and shipping containers often contain these pathogens that lead to deaths. And so there is some action, hopefully now more so to try to control that. Another thing that was brought up to mention was sort of the stormwater and the watersheds of Oakwell that really are connecting, honestly, Oakwell, Stoneleigh, and I was just looking at some maps of this the other day, and Villanova. So this one creek that sort of runs across those three properties, and sort of the wetlands. And Adam Langley was just talking about that this morning, that, it really does seem like some of these areas really could be termed true wetlands. And one of the biggest concerns about the destruction of Oakwell, other than all the other ones we've talked about, is the stormwater problem. So as you can imagine, those enormous old oak trees there are taking up huge amounts of carbon, but they are also storing huge amounts of water, right? Plant tissue is massively made of water, right? And so plants store tons of water. And as Dr. Wieder showed in his presentation with deforestation, when there are no trees there, water tends to run downhill and cause flooding. And so that I can see from my office window at Villanova, the Oakwell, and when if those trees are no longer there, that water will run right onto Villanova's property and cause flooding for neighbors, for campus, and for many in the area, which is of course devastating in its own way. And I think that's something that we really need to start thinking about with natural forest fragments. We have an amazing stormwater center on campus that actually advises the city of Philadelphia in their stormwater management. And Philadelphia, surprisingly and amazingly, is one of the most progressive cities in terms of their stormwater planning, and had been working with Villanova engineers on this, people like Dr. Bridget Wadzuck, one of our great colleagues here at Villanova. So yeah, I think that's a really good point that was pointed out in the chat. Um, there was another chat, Dr. Wieder, about are these invasive species that are killing off those trees still here today?
Yes. Uh, so I was saying for chestnuts, there's a property called McCaig Woods at the end of King of Prussia Road, where the Roberts Elementary School is. So that's a nice chunk of woods that is public. You can walk through there. And on one of the ridges, I haven't been there in a couple of years, but I used to be able to find many chestnut sprouts. But every one of them, you can see the wound on the surface of the bark, that orange color and cracking. And so that means they're infected. And I know the last time I went, there were a lot fewer than there had been in the past. So efforts to reestablish chestnut are focusing on developing trees that have resistance or using hybrids. So we can't just plant, find some chestnuts that we've saved and plant them. They'll suffer the same fate. I'm not 100% sure about the elm, but I think if you tried to plant American elms here, there's a good chance that the fungus would there.
Yeah, we have a new faculty member here at Villanova, Dr. Jen Santoro, who's a forest ecologist, who's really amazing. And she's been doing a lot of the drone mapping of the forest areas on campus and certainly in other places. And she's actually also working on some of these chestnut projects and looking at the few chestnuts that we still have in this area. Her and one of her senior thesis did a great project on this last year. So if people are interested, we can let you know more about that. She's doing some really cool work. What would prevent Villanova from developing it in the future in the way it has in other properties on Lancaster currently on campus by the church? Would there need to be some kind of covenant? So Betty Lee Davis asked that question. Dr. Wieder, you want to take that? You've been in administration more than I.
It would take students and faculty clearly articulating to the people that make decisions about land use on Villanova that things like the remaining forest that we have on campus should remain forest. I think I'm fully aware that Villanova developed a lot. Some of the developments have been in not particularly forested places, but some have. And I think those past developments, we haven't had enough of an input. So I'll put some of it on us. But we try and learn, at least I try and learn as I get ever older, that remaining silent is being part of the problem. So, like everywhere, I would conjecture that there are people in decision-making positions at Villanova who may feel differently about, from my view, is where we have nice chunks of forest on property, they should stay. There probably are people who don't necessarily agree with that. And so, the problem with the township with regard to Oakwell, it's not unique to Oakwell. So I would acknowledge that in this regard, Villanova has not been a leader. And I just hope that we can do no harm. I guess that's what I hope would happen in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess all we can assure you, Betty, is that I think things are different now, right? We were actually having this conversation this morning and something else. As someone said, it's not 1995 anymore. Like forest fragments, we know how important they are for clean air and public health. They trap particles that are problematic for our lungs. I had a meeting with someone recently that talked about why don't we have something like the Clean Water Act for forests when we now know all of the ecosystem services that these forests provide for us. The city of Philadelphia is trying to get their canopy back up to 30%, not just because it's pretty, right? But because it's good for public health. And so I think that the atmosphere has changed, but you are absolutely right that there would have to be some pretty outspoken faculty and student discussions that a property like that and the other properties that Villanova has recently purchased would, be managed with sustainability and ecosystem stewardship in mind. I can tell you that at our center, we are very committed to that. A couple other quick questions. Did Lower Merion School District give a reason for why they're not interested in the purchase? No, not, I think it was just initially, it was the eminent domain issue. And then more recently, no, I don't know. I mean, I think it's worth us. We did have a conversation about this just last week with some of our administrators, but I think it's worth, continuing to, these are conversations that occur over our heads. Dr. Wieder, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, but I wouldn't have put that Villanova was going to buy the property and still would on that slide if I didn't know that it was okay with the university for me to do that.
That's right.
So they have told, not me directly, but people in our center, yes, you may tell people that we want to buy the property.
Yes.
So.
Agreed. Any other questions for Dr. Wieder? I think we handled most things in the chat. Well, thanks so much to everyone for coming. I'm so inspired by everyone's hard work on this issue. It's really taught me a lot about activism and organizing, and many of you that are asking these great questions are those people that have led that effort. And so thank you for teaching us about this. And thank you to Kel for this awesome reflection on Pennsylvania forests. I certainly learned a lot.
Thank you all for all that you do.